There's an ancient tradition of legitimate conduct in wartime, but it's only in the middle of the 19th century, in the Union Army, that we see a set of rules. So the issuance of rules for the Union Army by Abraham Lincoln is really one of the critical founding moments of this tradition that we think of as very modern and is very salient for us in the last decade or so, but really begins in the American Civil War.
Welcome to the Forum from the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. Joining us today is John Fabian Witt, the author of multiple books related to the history of law in the United States. He's a professor of law and history at Yale, a Guggenheim Fellow, and very recently he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in history for the book he's here to discuss today, Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History. It's worth noting, by the way, that over the course of the past semester, I think we have had at least a half dozen Pulitzer Prize winners or finalists here on the Miller Center Forum. So it's a good tradition that will keep going. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Doug. It's great to be here.
Your book, as I told you earlier today, in a way was, I thought I was having you come talk to us about the Civil War. But in a way, that's not exactly what your book is about. And so we want to talk a lot more about that. But first, I want to ask you a question that I get asked a version of all the time, and that is, when did you learn that you were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize? And how did you find out?
Yeah. I found out when they announced the finalists. So anybody who was paying attention on a Monday afternoon a week or two ago, of course, when you find out you're a finalist, you also find out you didn't win. Which many of my students didn't understand. They would email me saying, well, we're keeping our fingers crossed for you. I'd say, well, you see. But it's a great honor and a privilege. I'm delighted to have been in the running. Yeah.
Well, it's very well deserved. And certainly I know that when things rise to that level, who actually wins and who's a finalist is a sort of indistinguishable lining up of the stars. That's
my line. I'm going with it.
It's true. But let's talk about it. I always heard that the laws of war and the efforts of man to contain war and impose laws upon soldiers in the midst of battle, my impression was that was a modern thing, that began really after World War II and the horror of discovering the Holocaust and the extreme venality of the Nazis and the Japanese, the way the story was told, in the Nuremberg trials, and that was the beginning of the notion of laws of war and adjudication of those laws. But your book tells us that's clearly not the case.
Yeah, this is the story that I stumbled on and has been pursuing for the last 7 years or so. And there is an ancient tradition of the idea of legitimate conduct in wartime. There's a medieval just war Catholic tradition, but it's only in the middle of the 19th century that we see in the Union Army in the United States the promulgation for an armed force in the field of a set of rules that can be issued in pamphlet form for newly literate armies. This is one of the first times you have a literate army. And so the issuance of these rules for the Union Army by in order approved by Abraham Lincoln is really one of the critical founding moments of this tradition that we think of as very modern and is very salient for us in the last decade or so, but really begins in the American Civil War.
And I want to hear why that is, but let's also, in the book, you also, in fascinating ways, you tell us that it even predates all of that there is, and it's referenced in the Constitution, is the law of nations, a law that was nonetheless unwritten, but at the time, but incorporated into the Constitution, something that the founders, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, were very aware of, and questions about the appropriate conduct of war. The conversation really begins there. So take us back to that very beginning.
So the law of nations is a body of customary rules designed to govern and coordinate the conduct of states with one another. This is a really useful thing to have. I mean, there are now some highfalutin ideals and principles attached to them, but just in a very basic way, it's very useful for statesmen to know what the basic ground rules are in conducting themselves with one another. Just think about rules for ambassadors. or the like. I mean, it allows conversations to go on. Even before it creates content for what states have to do, it just allows for conversations and coordination among states. And the Founding Fathers are very aware of this, in part because they want to be a state. So if you want to be a state, one of the things you can do to show that you're worthy of being a state is by following the guidelines set down by the Law of Nations.
And so this is where things come from, that a white flag is a symbol of truce, and you can't shoot the guy with the white flag as he's coming over to try to talk to you, or you can't kill an ambassador of another country even if you're in a state of belligerence with them.
Right, that's right. If you think of truce flags, the white flag rule, that's a really critical rule, and Lincoln and the Civil War generation certainly think so. And the reason is that everybody should want the white flag rule to exist. If you want to win the war, you'd like the other side to be able to surrender. They can't surrender if they think that in doing so they'll be shot. So in order to win wars, or in order to be able to lose them a little bit less horrifically, everybody wants the white flag rule to exist. That's a great example.
Yeah. And so Jefferson and Washington and others are aware of all this, but you tell us that George Washington was an accused war criminal.
That's right.
Of sorts.
The very beginning of Washington's career, which many of you will know, is as an officer in the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War starts in the Ohio River Valley in the 1750s when Washington encounters a group of Frenchmen, and the fog of war takes over, as it so often does in these situations. And we're not really sure what happened, but we're sure that the French don't come out of it very well. In fact, they're left dead in the Ohio River Valley. And accusations begin to surface and circulate around the Western world that Washington was complicit in an assassination there, that he executed the French soldiers there in the Ohio River Valley. And this begins a process of forming Washington's reputation. We could think of Washington's upright behavior for the next decades of his life as, in part, an effort to overcome this early mark on his reputation.
So you're also suggesting he did not chop down a cherry tree?
Yes, it's one. I mean, Parson Weems, the man who invents in the Washington biographies of the early 19th century the cherry tree story, and really just invents it, leaves this out of the story. That is to say, this early adventure in the Ohio River Valley woods is not a part of the Parson Weems hagiography.
It's fascinating. And, but then Jefferson as well. Jefferson wrestles with some of these issues, both in what he wrote, his actions as the governor of Virginia, but then also the writing of the drafting of the founding documents, and begins to wrestle with the tension between, which is one of the most fascinating aspects of your book, the tension between slavery and crimes of war, which is not a concept those are two things I would never have connected before reading your book.
Right. I had not thought that this was going to be a book in which slavery would play a large role, maybe even play a role at all. But one of the things I encountered, starting in the Revolutionary era, was a fierce commitment on the side of folks like Jefferson, Virginians in particular, I say here in Virginia, to the idea that one of the cardinal sins of wartime conduct was freeing enemy slaves. Freeing enemy slaves was a terrifying thing to contemplate in the eyes of white Virginians. There were two problems with it. One, it was an attack on private property. Slaves were private property, went the theory, and so slaves were an illegitimate target. In the same way that attacking civilian property generally, or attacking civilians, would be an illegitimate target today. But there was another side of it, which was the terror of slave insurrection. And slave insurrection was something that Western societies had known going back to antiquity, with servile wars among the ancients, and had been a continuing problem for American colonies in British North America through the colonial period, and then into the antebellum era as well.
And so I want to not get too legalistic, but I want you to help us through this as a group of non-attorneys for the most part. But you talk about that there was a notion of slavery, a legal construct of slavery, that in effect that slavery itself was a kind of Cold War, because the enslaved person was in a position of conflict with the enslaver, and that related, that it was a kind of war in and of itself, and that is the beginning of its connection to the laws of war. But sort of walk us through, in layman's terms, that logic.
Well, one thing I'll say at the outset is I don't think that this is too technical a field. That is, one of the things that this whole field is about governing soldiers and officers in the field. If it were too technical, it wouldn't even begin to be able to shape the way in which conflict happens. So it's actually not a technical field at all. And this is a useful example for that. One of the things that preoccupied slave societies was justifying slavery. I mean, I think we often imagine it was just tradition, but there were active conversations and contestations about what the foundation of slavery was. And the leading theory by the end of the 18th century for justifying this regime was the idea that slaves or their ancestors, and that's a complicated trick, but slaves or their ancestors had been captured in battle. They were prisoners of war. And in the early modern period, the prisoner of war was subject to being executed. So the idea of the enslavement is a lesser included power. If you can execute someone, well, surely they would agree to be enslaved rather than executed. So that's the foundational concept for the legality of slavery. And what this means, as you say, is that every plantation is essentially a place with a suppressed form of warfare. That is, the slave or his descendants is, in some sense, a continuing prisoner of war, right there on the plantation. And so the fear was that if hot war should reach the plantation, if British raiding parties in the Chesapeake should go onto plantations and undo the suppression of warfare that was the slave relationship, that hot war would break out again, and at a time when white men were away from the plantations oftentimes. So that's the terror of slave insurrection.
And Jefferson writes that, and in this regard, more from the preceding traditions, but Jefferson, in his descriptions of how war should be fought and how it should be contained, that this notion that war is between the states and is between the leaders and the combatants of states or of the parties at war, and that peasants and farmers and civilians who are not actively engaged in the war, that war should be almost invisible to them in some manner, and that there's this extreme detachment between the role of civilians and presumably the people they have enslaved as well, including him. But then at the same time, though, he is also a fairly ruthless enforcer of the idea that once we get to the Revolutionary War, around British misconduct, as governor of Virginia, he puts a British general in chains under very harsh conditions. But walk us through the mind, the sort of contradictory mind of Thomas Jefferson around all of this.
So Jefferson's a fascinating character on all these things. And one of the reasons to pay attention to Jefferson in this story is it's a shorthand way of making sense of the deep traction that the laws of war had on the founding generation. We think of the laws of war as something that have surged to the presence in the last 10 years or so. But it turns out that this is a tradition that goes way back and preoccupied the founders and virtually every generation up to the present. So for Jefferson, there are a set of European ideas that are circulating in the middle of the 18th century that he is enormously sophisticated in. We all know about his library and his books. Well, in that library and in those books were ideas about limiting warfare to battlefields, keeping it away from the productive members of society, keeping it away from plantations and peasants and the like. Now that's an idea that's powerfully in the interest of a southern white population for whom, if the war goes to plantations, they don't know what's going to happen. That's a real terror there. At the same time, Jefferson's engaged in enforcing the laws of war against the British. One of the great episodes of the war involves a British officer named Henry Hamilton, who's accused by Jefferson and other Virginians of engaged in atrocities with Indians, mostly on the western frontier. And Jefferson manages to hold Hamilton in close confinement, not as a prisoner of war, but rather as a criminal during his course as governor of Virginia. And we see there Jefferson engaging the laws of war on all different sides, worried about slaves, worried about frontier atrocities with Indians, and engaged in retaliation against British officers for violations of the rules that he held dear.
And in that case, the specific allegation is that the British are employing Native Americans to attack white settlers, Americans, in savage ways, and that represents a crime of its own.
Hamilton is the hair buyer, right? Because he buys scalps. That's the accusation.
But with no particular concern about the fact that the Americans do similar things at times in terms of their Native American allies, in terms of relying on Native Americans to try to attack the British or the French before that, right?
Right. This is one of the central threads that runs through the history of the laws of war is the question of hypocrisy. So virtually every regime that has articulated a set of ideals and rules for warfare also finds itself pushing up against the edge of those rules and finds itself certainly the object of accusations of hypocrisy. And so we can see that in Jefferson from the very outset of the war. And Jefferson really seems to have applied two different standards to American conduct and to British conduct, or at least to cast a relatively lenient eye on American conduct. And I don't want to run away from the hypocrisy charge, not my own hypocrisy, you understand, but the charge of American hypocrisy at all. At the same time, the hypocrisy charge is often attached to a different kind of a story about the irrelevance of the laws of war. If it's just hypocrisy through and through, then it wasn't doing any work, goes this story. And that's a story that's also been around for a long time and continues to be very powerful today. But I don't think that's right. That is, I think we see lots of forms of cultural work that in which the laws of war accomplish things, sometimes perverse things, but make a difference, even after the guns start shooting.
And then so the Revolutionary period, the early American period, is then followed by these several decades in which, surprisingly, the United States becomes this prominent international advocate for all manner of international treaties and in the early origins of international law, some related to all of this. Though I guess it's also easier and logical that the U.S. would be very pure, America would be very pure about how wrong it is for a ship from a foreign fleet to come into a harbor and burn the homes of civilians. That's something we would be very opposed to making illegal, particularly since there was no chance that we were ever going to sail a ship into the harbor of another nation because we didn't have the ships to do it, really. But I mean, so we become great advocates of rules that apply to the rest of the world, but it's at a time when it's unlikely they would ever apply to us.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's in the United States' interest to articulate rules that will protect weak states in the first decades of the 19th century. You see the United States championing the idea of neutral rights during the course of the Napoleonic conflict. This is something that Jefferson thinks the United States can fatten off of, the Napoleonic conflict in which Europe is torn up by war, and the United States can be the supplier, the merchant, who goes into all of the contending sides in Europe and sells them goods they need. So neutral rights becomes one of the central planks of American statesmanship, and that's a law of war idea, the neutral's rights in times of conflict. So we see a lot of interest, that is self-interest, running through the laws of war, but we can't explain the entire position by reference to self-interest. That is to say, the positions are drawn from a body of principles that exist independent of American self-interest and constrain the way Americans can assert their self-interest in them. And when American positions change, when America becomes a strong power, we'll see these positions start to have some bite in interesting and complicated ways.
And interestingly, in that period of time, one thing, though, that American leaders, and Jefferson himself, remained very committed to, and the War of 1812 inflames this further for some Americans, this notion that slaves seized in the course of war, or liberated in the course of war, remain the property of their owners and must be returned. And that becomes a very big issue, you write, through the War of 1812, where you also have significant numbers of black combatants on the side of the British. But Jefferson himself, at an earlier point, when his slaves are freed by British troops, he then goes to great lengths later to get them back, and eventually does get some of them back.
Right. There's two of the great diplomatic projects of the early republic are the pursuit of compensation or return of the slaves taken off by British in wartime. Both in 1783, when thousands of slaves leave with the British from New York Harbor at the end of the Revolution, and then again in 1813, 1814 in the War of 1812. And we see leading American statesmen, ranging from John Jay in the 1790s to John Quincy Adams in the 1810s and 20s, pursuing the project of getting compensation for slaves, making the argument, and John Quincy Adams really is the leader on this argument in the 1810s and 20s, making the argument that the laws of war make it unlawful for British raiding parties to take off slaves during the course of and in the aftermath of war, and that the treaty, especially the Treaty of Ghent, 1814 to end the War of 1812, the treaty terms themselves embody this, encode this law of war rule against the British and require compensation. And so Adams spends the next decade and a half of his life pursuing compensation. Not coincidentally, he's a Northerner running for president. He's got to show his bona fides to the South. This was one good way to do that, to pursue against, I mean, everyone knows the Addams family is more or less anti-slavery. There's no mystery about that. And so for him to go about seeking compensation for and insisting on the legal protection of slaves is a smart maneuver by someone who's well trained in the ways of Washington, D.C. if he wants to become president.
And all of this then sets the stage for the Civil War period, where now the Civil War begins. The first question that arrives that relates to slaves, but that will also have other issues related to conduct of the war, is that the Union leadership is not made up of people who are committed necessarily to racial justice or the equality of blacks and whites, I take it. And so there's this question of what to do about the African Americans who are running away from slaves in the South, joining up with Union lines. But what happens there?
So this is one of the great stories of American history. The spring of 1861, and two things happen right away. One is slaves start appearing in Union fortifications. Fortress Monroe in Virginia is one of the first places this happens, and Union officers have to figure out what to do with them. And so Benjamin Butler, Union general, concludes that he'll take in slaves who arrive at Union lines if they're being used in the war effort by the enemy. He calls them contraband. He uses the language of contraband in order to describe them. And contraband is a word that he draws from the laws of war, but in a very strange way. It comes from the maritime law of warfare. But the basic idea is a relatively uncontroversial one in the laws of war, is that the property that your enemy is using against you, you're allowed to take. So this is not a controversial move in the laws of war, but it's the beginning of a story that over the course of the next 2 years will transform the United States. The other way in which we see slavery at work at the outset of the war is that Union generals like George McClellan hold true to the long-standing American tradition. Their view is that slaves can't be taken in wartime. And so their commitment is to stop slave insurrection should it arise. So McClellan assures slave owners that if slave insurrection rises, he will stop the war for the moment, put down slave insurrection, and then resume the war thereafter. So the Union position at the outset of the war is one that in no way reflects what will soon happen.
And does reflect, though, this absolute fealty to the notion of the ownership of slaves and the importance of preserving that. But I guess also reflects that at the beginning of the Civil War, there is this notion that somehow this can all be resolved relatively quickly, that this can be a very civilized war. We're going to have a handful of engagements that will resolve everything, or one side or the other will quickly give. And so this idea that you could stop the war and put down that stopping slave insurrection is more important than fighting the war, I guess can only exist in a presumption of this very civilized military affair.
That's right, and this is the great paradox of the laws of war in the American Civil War. The moment that the Union gets serious about thinking about what the law of war is and what it consists of, is the moment at which the Union decides to drop the gloves, to abandon what Lincoln called the Rosewater strategy of the war's first year and a half, and it's just that moment that they get serious about thinking about the laws of war. Now, this is at odds with the way we usually see the laws of war happen in world history. The laws of war usually happen in the dismayed aftermath of conflict, when the world is horrified by what's taken place in the years before. This is the pattern after World War II. Our Geneva Conventions today are 1949. That's not a coincidence. That's reflecting on what happened in World War II. It's very rare for the laws of war to become something that people pay attention to in the middle of the conflict, when it's a conflict that you're on the stronger side of. That's one of the really remarkable features of the Union participation in this project.
And so then enters onto the scene a man named Francis Lieber. Who is he, and how is it that he comes to write what you call Lincoln's Code?
Yeah, so Francis Lieber is a Prussian immigrant who, in the early republic, in the antebellum period, 1830s and 40s, became one of the United States' most garrulous public intellectuals. He never stopped talking, he never stopped writing. Any public issue of the day, he weighed in on. He was a professor at the University of South Carolina College, for a couple decades, and then later on became, but in the 1850s, a professor at Columbia College in New York City. And in the end of the fall of 1862, just after the Lincoln administration has done its annual message to Congress, Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief, realizes that 3 weeks hence, the Emancipation Proclamation will be final. And that Emancipation Proclamation will run into the face of 90 years of American history on the question of slaves in wartime. And so Halleck commissions Lieber to draft a restatement of the Laws of War, a pamphlet that will restate the rules from European conflicts, but state them in a way that will transform the position of the United States on the slavery question. Will state that slavery is not protected by the laws of war, but in fact is subject to destruction by the laws of war, that free armies can destroy slavery as they go, that black soldiers are entitled to prisoner of war protections, and the project is to transform the slavery problem that John Quincy Adams has created for Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson has created for Abraham Lincoln. And that's why we see the administration commission a law of war restatement at the end of 1862.
And this is shocking to the South, that escaped slaves who then join service of the Union Army, that the Union is expecting that they will be treated the same way that white soldiers would be. I mean, and what was the Southern attitude toward black soldiers?
So one of the great puzzles for me as I went through this was why is it the Union that's innovating in the laws of war? Why don't we see the innovations come from the Confederacy? The Confederacy is really remarkably traditional in its American commitments to the laws of war. It insists that slavery is inviolate in wartime and that any black soldier in uniform is either a slave engaged in insurrection, which is to say a criminal, subject to execution and the punishment appropriate for slaves engaged in insurrection, or is an abolitionist stirring up slave insurrection, and so a criminal for that reason. So the South decides, and Jefferson Davis leads the way on this, that black soldiers will not be entitled to prisoner of war protection. And that produces a huge crisis, because it's just that moment. This is late 1862, early 1863. The Union's beginning to have difficulty recruiting new white soldiers from the North. Black soldiers are becoming a critical part of the Union war effort. And in order to continue to recruit free black soldiers from the North, the Lincoln administration can't sell them down the river by abandoning the protection of them as prisoners of war. So that's really a critical moment. It's one of the central reasons why the administration feels the need to issue a restatement of the law of war at this moment.
And Lieber at one point, I mean, this, and throughout the code, there is this combination of both humanitarian impulse and the importance of minimizing or mitigating the damage and injury of war, but coupled with that, the permission to engage in the most brutal imaginable kind of war. But one aspect of that brutality is that he proposes, I don't think this ultimately makes it into the code, but he proposes that for every captured black soldier who is then sent back into slavery, that one captured Confederate prisoner be executed, one for one. That's his original proposal, right?
That's right, and then that does actually make the code. The code is just a restatement of what's permissible. So when Lincoln issues a retaliation order at the end of July of 1863 to deal with this problem of black prisoners of war, he declines to go the furthest extent permissible. So Lincoln declines to promise to execute white Confederate prisoners of war in retaliation. Lieber, the drafter, Lieber's view is that since you're not going to enslave white prisoners of war, the Union's not going to enslave anyone, the only thing left to them is execution. But this gets us to a broader point about the code. We shouldn't expect this code to be a set of humanitarian handcuffs. It's adopted by a Union that's committed at this moment, late 1862, early 1863, to adopting a much fiercer form of warfare. And that's a lesson about the laws of war more generally. The laws of war only have traction because they find a complicated balance between humanitarian constraint and the empowering and the licensing of destruction. Emancipation was a massive destruction of private property. And this project is to license emancipation, so we shouldn't be surprised to see it on both sides of this humanitarian fierce divide.
And so just to finish the detail on it, though, rather than executing these Confederate prisoners, Lincoln says that they would be sentenced to hard labor, essentially. Right. For every slave who's sent back to slavery, every black person in slavery, Confederate POWs are sent to hard labor, which one might call slavery by another name.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
But then this. Talk a little bit more about this balancing act between the brutality, which the exigencies of war, essentially, that there's this principle applied to almost every limitation in the code. There is also an exception that says, but you don't have to follow that if in the exigencies of the moment, the military necessities of the moment, that if the only way to achieve victory is by doing this thing, then it's okay.
Yeah, the 18th century European jurists who had they were the authors of the customary principles that came down to Lincoln's generation. Their view had been that the laws of war can only work if we set aside the question of who's right and who's wrong. If we think that the war is about figuring out who's right and who's wrong, and we regulate prisoner of war questions by reference to that, well, we'll just descend into unending violence. I'll imagine that the prisoner of war I've captured is subject to criminal prosecution because he's fighting in an unjustified way. If you shoot at someone without justification, the criminal laws ought to be applied to you. The move of the 18th century, which Lincoln inherits, is a move to set aside those ideas of right and wrong for purposes of regulating the conflict. Now, Lincoln's observation in the fall of 1862, as emancipation is coming down the pike, is that if I'm really serious about setting aside the question of who's right and who's wrong, what the heck am I doing in this war in the first place? How can I go about a project of reunifying the Union, knowing that tens of thousands of men have already been killed, that hundreds of thousands of men will be killed in the future, if I'm not sure, deep down, that I'm right? And so the Union project of restating the laws of war is a project of restating a law of war that will combine both of these twin imperatives. The moral modesty, which is required for us to keep war from spiraling out of control, combined with the righteousness, the sense of certainty, that's required to be in war at the first place. And absent both of those things, warfare will be a terrible, terrible thing. It is a terrible, terrible thing. But absent both of those things, it will inevitably descend into wanton, cruel, irrational violence. And the Lincoln Project and the Lieber Project is to constrain violence into rational channels. That's the project. That's the balance, the hard balance.
How much did Lincoln participate in this, and how much did he know about this?
Yeah. So the code is commissioned by General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. And Stanton, the Secretary of War, Stanton, is in on the project from an early period. What we know about Lincoln's participation, I would say there's three things we know. One is the military necessity rationale that runs through the code, that licenses fierce forms of violence, matches perfectly the Emancipation Proclamation, which has been issued. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is September 22nd, 1862. The code is written across the winter of 62-63, and the final Emancipation Proclamation is January 1st, 1863. And the Emancipation Proclamation's fundamental warrant is military necessity. So the code adopts Lincoln's theory of the just war. And we also know that Lincoln approves the order on April 24th, 1863, and sends it out into the world. And we know that when Lincoln, at the end of July 63, writes a retaliation order, the one we've been describing, that he uses word for word the passage from the code, with the important exception we just described, that Lieber has written. So we know that Lincoln engages with the code in a couple different ways, but historians have generally imagined that the absence of further engagement, of evidence of Lincoln late at night editing the manuscript, which doesn't happen, means that this is not an important part of the Civil War's history or Lincoln's history. And what I've tried to do is just by attaching the law of war to emancipation, revise that story, because we can't understand either without the other.
And in the end, the code goes into existence at the central moment in the war, which is then followed by, ironically perhaps, that after the imposition of this code of war, many of the most terrible things in the war occur after that. Sherman's March to the Sea, the burning of Atlanta, the very wanton, openly admitted indiscriminate shelling of Atlanta, Sherman's specific intent to kill as many civilians as he can, or at least his willingness to say that, and then all manner of other atrocities and such that happen on his way down to Savannah. So how is it that it's in the aftermath of adopting this code that then the most uncivilized warfare of the war commences?
Doug's got Atlanta roots, I understand, so I thought Atlanta might come up in this conversation. Historians have been skeptical. I think historians have been skeptical about the law of war generally throughout history. I mean, what is it that these rules might possibly accomplish, goes the historian's critique. It's got to have a realist kind of a critique. What is it the laws of war could possibly accomplish once the guns start shooting? And historians of the Civil War have been especially skeptical. After all, it's not clear that the laws of war should apply to a civil war at all. The Union position is this is a criminal conspiracy. It's not a war. We're not fighting against another country, says the Lincoln administration. We're fighting against a bunch of criminals. We can see this, for example, James McPherson's great The Battle Cry of Freedom, a book that many of you no doubt are familiar with. It is the great history of the Civil War of the last generation or two. No reference to Francis Lieber, no reference to the laws of war, no reference to this story we're talking about today. But I think the reason why historians have been, in my view, misled about the significance of the laws of war is that for every generation in American history, the laws of war have worked differently. We shouldn't expect to see, when we look into history, judge advocates standing behind commanders making targeting decisions. That's not how the laws of war worked in the American Civil War, which is not to say, though, that the laws of war didn't have a lot of traction in shaping the way the conflict happened. If we read the code carefully that Lincoln approves, that Lieber writes, Sherman's March to the Sea is a culmination, a vindication of the fierce view of the code. Sherman's strategic, instrumental violence is the kind of thing that we should expect to see in modern warfare under the code. The part of the Sherman's March that violates the code, and that Francis Lieber was very worried about. He was following Sherman to the sea very closely. He was in correspondence with an officer named Hitchcock, who was one of Sherman's chief officers. And Lieber's terrified of Sherman's bummers. The men who are straggling behind, who are scooping up property off of plantations, burning plantations in wanton and willful ways. That's irrational violence. That's violence spiraling out of control. That's what the laws of war are designed to minimize. So if we think about the laws of war that way, as empowering violence as well as limiting it, then all of a sudden the idea of Sherman's March being a contradiction to the laws of war is a little bit less troubling. And we can start to see how the laws of war actually work in practice.
So the one aspect of the code, as I understand it, where there was not the exception for military necessity, relates to torture and inflicting pain upon prisoners to try to extract information from them. The code is absolutely explicit that under no circumstances is that permissible, an absolute violation of the laws of war, as understood at the time. So does that tell us, and this is a serious question, do we infer from that then that were Abraham Lincoln and Lieber here with us today, would they tell us that George Bush and his leadership team were war criminals?
So the torture rule in the code is a really striking rule. It's a really striking rule because it's anomalous in the code. The code is full of exceptions for grave circumstances, including exceptions for things as horrifying as the execution of prisoners of war. There's a glorious rule articulated by the code: you may not execute prisoners of war. But then the next paragraph says, unless military necessity in a grave crisis so requires. And that's characteristic of the code. The torture rule doesn't have such an exception. And I think the reason for Lieber that the torture rule doesn't have that exception, it isn't any what he would have called mawkish sentimentality about the victim of the torture. There's a righteous, fierce righteousness that Lieber brings to the conflict of wars that are justified. Lieber is worried about the torturer. He's worried about what torture does to a society that engages in it. He's worried about armies in the aftermath of wars. Those soldiers have to become democratic citizens. Leaders who engaged in terrible decision-making in war have to become peacetime leaders of a republic. And that's the grounding for Lieber for his hard and fast rule against torture, is a sense that torture does things to citizens that can't be undone. Now, I don't want to be too sanguine about the rule. The Civil War doesn't put much pressure on the torture rule. You capture hundreds of men at a time, sometimes thousands. There are oftentimes men who don't want to be in the conflict in the first place. They'd like, in fact, to be on the other side of the conflict. So it's not hard to get people to talk. It's not hard to confirm the story you hear from one guy by asking another. So there's not a whole lot of pressure put on the torture norm, with one important exception, which is in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination. And so we don't have Lincoln as a decision maker there, but we do have a frenzied investigation with the real possibility that there are more assassins out there, that the other Union officers and officials might be at risk. After all, it wasn't just Lincoln who's attacked on that night. But we don't see in those days and nights after the assassination, we don't see torture. And that says something to the power of this code.
But so, would somehow, and you can't reach into the mind of these individuals, but is it plausible to you that that applied today, that the exigencies of war standard would in fact, that these same fellows would say, actually, in this modern era, where espionage has a different kind of strategic importance, that somehow the need to win exemption would trump the absolute prohibition of torture, as the Bush administration argued, essentially?
I think that there's no doubt that the conduct that the United States engaged in after 9/11 was in violation of the terms of the Lieber Code, which is no longer a governing document. It's not. I don't mean to say that it was in violation of U.S. law because of the Lieber Code. There are other reasons it was in violation of U.S. law, different reasons. But it was at odds with the basic rule of the Lieber Code.
By the way, on on Lieber's concern about the effect on the torturer or the committer of the atrocities, there's a federal judge I know well in Atlanta, very senior judge, who was a young 19-year-old infantryman during World War II, and there was a particular point in a particular battle where his unit captured a small group of German soldiers. He was the youngest person there. They had to move to the next location immediately, didn't have capacity or resources to feed these men, and the officer in command came forward and said to line them up, and they executed them. They killed them all. And then moved on. And this guy, now 60 years later, is still an emeritus federal judge and one of the most liberal, I suspect, perhaps maybe the most passionate members of the bench anywhere in the federal judiciary, but still speaks back to that incident as being the root of so much of his thinking in terms of his conduct through the rest of life. So it's these sorts of things are powerful observations on the human psyche.
It's part of why I wanted to write this book, is that the laws of war produce these terrible moral situations, and they're terrible moral situations that ordinary people, ordinary men, ordinary women more and more, now encounter. It's not just lawyers and diplomats inside rooms like this one having a debating society, although I like debating societies. So it allowed me to try to figure out, in some sense, how law works, when it breaks down, what its significance is. That's what I was able to get into.
And of course, those American soldiers were never prosecuted, and there was never even a record made of the events that had occurred on that day. Which gets to another point, and that is that there's no possibility, I take it, that any nation is going to abide by laws of war which would lead to its defeat. I mean, that's completely outside the possibility of human expectation, right?
Well, so one of the most terrible passages in the code is a passage that sits strangely in the surrounding text, and it says, "To save the country is the paramount consideration." Now, it's possible on one reading that is even an exception to the torture rule, because it doesn't say paramount consideration to everything else in the code. It leaves it indeterminate. But that idea of existential threats and the rules going out the window is a powerful one, even internal to the law of war itself. In the 1990s, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, was asked to decide whether or not it could say that the use of nuclear weapons was per se unlawful. And it decided that it couldn't say either way, that there were circumstances, the existential threat to a small republic facing a massive army, in which maybe the use of nuclear weapons would be permissible under international humanitarian law. So that runs through. But I don't think that means that in those moments, the laws of war go out the window. That is, the laws of war persist. They persist not as an outside policeman coming in and saying no and being able to make that order stick. They persist as a moral tradition, a set of moral guidelines, a set of coordinating rules that have real consequences for the aftermath. You can be sure that things you do in the here and now in an armed conflict will be subject to recriminations, moral contestation in the aftermath of the conflict, and that those contestations and recriminations will be grounded in the moral rules that the laws of war try to articulate. So the laws of war persist through these moments of crisis, and that's what makes them worth studying.
Two last things, and then I want to go to the audience. And so if you do have questions you want to ask, then make your presence known to Christina soon. But the last two things. One, in fairness to other contemporary administrations, the code also forbid assassination and also forbid the use of poison, which we can probably interpret as mysterious and exotic weapons of its time. But so under the notion of the absolute prohibition, except with the exigencies of war, of assassination, would Lieber and Lincoln tell us that Barack Obama was a war criminal?
Well, you know, Lincoln was really interested in new inventions related to war. This is one of the interesting sub-themes of the war. And Lieber, too, was interested in them. The Union even would go to Lieber and ask him for advice on new instruments of war that they found. And Lieber would write advisory opinions on things like booby traps and the like. And in general, the view that Lieber articulated was that you couldn't say in the abstract, much like the ICJ in the 1990s with nuclear weapons, you couldn't say in the abstract. It all depended on whether in the particular circumstances some weapon was necessary to advance the instrumental rational project of winning a legitimate war. My sense is that the drones problem today will cause a going back to the 1860s generation. The chief way of making sense of drones today has been through the international humanitarian law of proportionality. You look to see whether the civilian casualties are proportionate to the direct military advantage achieved by the use of the drone in some particular circumstance. Now, this seems to me like it's not actually a useful way of getting at the real problem with the drones, or the real thing that causes worry about the drones. The drones are extraordinarily accurate. They are tragically not accurate enough oftentimes. I don't mean to deny that for a second, but they are the most accurate weapon, insofar as I can tell, that mankind has ever known, and they're getting more accurate every day. We should expect the proportionality problem to diminish over time, which is not to say that we shouldn't expect the real danger of drones to increase over time. And I think that the mix of ferocity and humility and modesty that Lieber and Lincoln brought to the table will inevitably be the framework that we apply to try to make sense of the drones and the thing that looks like assassination in the 21st century.
And finally, in the intervening years, since the Geneva Convention and the Nuremberg trials, the United States has continued to be probably the primary advocate for the creation of international courts and international laws, or certainly a primary advocate of that. And yet here we are, even with the creation of the International Criminal Court now, a permanently established body. We are in many respects the architects of those laws and those systems, and yet we continue to exempt ourselves and our own soldiers from the applicability. That seems to be consistent with the hypocrisy that you describe throughout history, but how can any nation maintain a moral standing around these sorts of issues if it is not willing to live by the same laws?
I think this part of our story, both participating in and resisting the application of the laws of war, I think we think of this as new to our era. This is our generation's way of approaching the laws of war. I think that's the general impression. And I think, after writing this book, that this story goes all the way back to the founding. This is Jefferson here in Virginia, applying the laws of war to the British and exempting himself. This is Lincoln struggling to restate humanitarian limits while authorizing emancipation, which is a violation of all that was held dear by American statesmen for 90 years before them. This is the constant tension in American history. It hasn't gone away, but we shouldn't think of it as new, novel to our era, as some aberration. And what this means, I think, is two things. One is, we're not in a brave new world where suddenly the laws of war are relevant where they weren't once before. The laws of war have been with American history from the very beginning, from 1750s in the woods of Ohio to the 21st century. But it also means that we shouldn't be too sanguine about the extent to which the laws of war will be a policeman from outside able to say yes or no. The laws of war are a framework for conversation. They're a way of shaping grave moral decisions, of framing grave moral decisions, and they're the way in which Americans have been talking about these decisions for a very long time. And I think that matters. I think the frame in which we have the conversation, the shape of that conversation, the language we use, and the moral guidelines in it, I think that matters, even if it doesn't eliminate all the hypocrisy, even if it doesn't eliminate all the apparent violations. I think it matters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Most interesting and very important. Thank you. I wondered what you thought of the work during World War II when Dr. Brock Chisholm, a psychiatrist in Canada, created research on botulinus toxin, a pint of which could kill everybody in the United States if properly delivered. And we delivered that information to Hitler, telling him that if you resort to germ warfare, we have it ready. It seemed to be an example of what you're talking about.
Well, no, I don't know that particular story, but I'll tell you that the two things I think of in response. One is about germ warfare running back. Germ warfare, originates, as far as I know, in conflicts between Indians and settlers in the colonial period, where we do see the use of things like smallpox as a weapon of war. We also see a long tradition of real anxiety about weapons that can get out of control. The problem with biological weapons is that they are indiscriminate. They don't engage in any of the targeting that we expect rational warfare to engage in. That's the real difficulty. Once a biological weapon is unleashed, you can't confine it to military targets. It's just not possible to do that. And that's the terrifying nature of it. Now, one last feature of this is engaging in the laws of war doesn't mean abandoning forms of retaliatory threats. I mean, we see actually in the 50 years after the Geneva Conventions in 1949, a period in which the laws of war actually become relatively recessive in the face of a different mechanism, a mechanism called deterrence. This is the strategy, the great successful strategy of the Cold War, is deterrence as a way of minimizing humanitarian atrocity. And that's what we see in your story. And that's very friendly to Lieber, but Lieber engages in deterrence thought a lot.
Thank you for being with us today. You spoke about the sort of public outrage that came about once allegations that George Washington killed these Frenchmen. And more recently, we also talked about the public outrage that came about once Guantanamo Bay and these intense interrogation tactics came to light. What is sort of what has been the role of public opinion in shaping sort of the development of these rules of war?
Public opinion, this is a great question, because public opinion is one of the central enforcers for the law of nations, for international law. And it's only very recently that there are institutions like the International Criminal Court that might be substitutes. But since time immemorial, the enforcement mechanism is some combination of military retaliation and public opinion, the costs of breaking rules for one's place in the world community. And I think we see that in the post-9/11 period. We see real costs exacted on the United States for engaging in behavior that seems to be at odds with the rules that it has that we have propounded for a very long time. So public opinion is really a central feature of this. In fact, Francis Lieber thought that public opinion ought to be the way the laws of war were enforced. I mean, retaliation and public opinion. He was skeptical, actually, of international tribunals. He thought of them as government from afar that could run amok, that could end up producing outcomes that would be actually difficult in the face of the goal of restoring the peace. And the International Tribunal might get it wrong according to that goal. So public opinion really is an important part of thinking about this for people like Lieber.
I'm troubled by your use of the term laws of war. Seems like we don't really have a law unless we have a means of enforcing it, means and mechanism of enforcing it. And we didn't have anything like that maybe until Nuremberg, and we began to talk about this kind of thing at Nuremberg, or we talk about crimes against humanity. But still the line is really fuzzy there about enforcement. For example, if we torture, the United States tortures, I believe the United States has practiced torture, but the talk about it doesn't turn on what we're going to do about it, but what really is torture. And we never have any effective means of enforcement.
Well, this is a great question, too. One of the grounds for skepticism about laws of war is the absence of judicial tribunals. How can it be law if there aren't judges, goes the story. Or in a second version of it, how can it be law if the only judges there are partial judges? That is to say, American judges in courts martial or military commissions. I am of the view that law exists independent of courts and judges. That is, we can think about the law as a kind of social glue that works in the minds of lay people, or ordinary people going about their business, soldiers in the field even. And that law is a tradition that can't be captured just by judges or just by courts. And if we think about it that way, then all of a sudden the field of what counts as the history of the laws of war is much wider and much more open. We can talk about Andrew Jackson, somebody we didn't get into here in our opening discussion. But Andrew Jackson is an important figure, in my view, in the American history of the laws of war. Now, there's never a court that thinks about whether or not Andrew Jackson's behavior in Florida in 1818 is consistent with the laws of war, but the Congress thinks about it a lot. There's a popular debate across the end of 1818 and into the beginning of 1819 about whether Jackson's conduct has violated the international laws of war or not. And I think that counts as law. It does mean that it's not a law that's going to be enforced by prison terms or fines, but it's a law that has real entailments, real costs. Jackson has to fight off these charges in order to launch his campaign for president. Now, I also don't want to exaggerate these costs. He wins that campaign for president. So, but that's the way this field of law works. And I think even in the world of international criminal courts, that's the way this field still works. It's still a field, a discursive field. I want to say that's too fancy a word. I just mean it's a way of talking. It's a way of talking and thinking about the world that creates costs for anyone participating in an armed conflict, costs that count.
But isn't there also, just to play off of that, isn't there also something of a debate going on right now about that by creating these international structures of justice and these severe penalties for committing war crimes or crimes against humanity, that by and large, you may encourage Bashar al-Assad to continue fighting to the death, rather than knowing that as soon as he stops, there is going to be no safe passage to another country, to another dictatorship. He's going to be brought before the International Criminal Court and tried as a war criminal, and probably, if he's tried by his own people, he's going to be hung the same way that Saddam Hussein was. So is it possible that the faulty attempt to create international standards of justice may sometimes facilitate more injustice?
Oh, no, there absolutely is. Lieber's generation of international lawyers were skeptical of international tribunals for much this reason. That is, the tradition well into the end of the 19th century and into the 20th is a tradition of forgetting. So putting things in the past and not engaging in post-war prosecutions. The Civil War is a little bit of a pivot here. You know, the term war crime doesn't exist, as far as I can tell, until 1865, when Francis Lieber uses it in a letter that he writes to Secretary of War Stanton, discussing what's going to happen to people like Jefferson Davis after the war. It's first used in print by a man named Bluntschli, who's a European jurist, who gets it from Lieber, with whom he's a close correspondent in 1868, 1870, 1872. So that idea of the war crime is in creation, and we see in the Civil War the beginning of war crimes prosecutions without the term at first. So the Civil War, I say, is a pivot moment where we're moving from a world of public opinion enforcement, which doesn't produce this problem, to a world of war crimes, which in the 20th century will come to fruition with war crimes tribunals and produce this dilemma that you described.
I would like to note that your university, Yale, has a fine website called the New Avalon Project, which details a great many and has a great many source documents associated with the laws of war. But I want to ask you a question. After Washington surrendered at Fort Necessity, he actually benefited from the laws of war, the very ones he was accused very shortly before of having violated. Did that contrast affect him in any way?
That's a great question. The Avalon Project, I should make a plug for this. The librarians at the Yale Law School are among the finest research librarians on the face of the earth. And they have put together this massive collection, which is available to anybody to go to. It's not behind a firewall of any kind, which has just an enormous number of really wonderful documents. You're exactly right about that. The Fort Necessity moment is a great moment. This is when on a rainy night, Washington either misreads or has misinterpreted a document and agrees to sign on to a surrender document in which he makes himself complicit by his own admission in an assassination. That's the word that the document uses. That's part of the reason why he becomes notorious in the years thereafter. And the idea that something in that moment, when he benefits from prisoner of war privileges, the idea that helps animate his views moving forward is an interesting idea. It sounds plausible. He is very concerned throughout the Revolution to be an upstanding observer of the laws of war. He sounds like, in his correspondence with his British counterparts, he sounds like a European jurist. He says, we need to treat prisoners of war as such. And so you see exactly that kind of a change in the way he behaves.
Hi, so you mentioned earlier that the Civil War was the first war in America where the majority of the soldiers were literate. And knowing that the slave body was illiterate, I was wondering, like, how much did they know about the laws of war and their position as possibly contraband on the Union side, or just their general position in war as private property or anything like that?
This is a really great question. It's one that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get information about. And part of the problem is that the archival sources are not distributed justly. The sources we have come from Union soldiers. We have some stuff from Confederate soldiers too, but we know very little in written form about what slaves thought about the laws of war. But I have no doubt, in fact we know, that slaves had themselves a set of codes, rules, moral traditions that attached to the use of violence. And one of the ways we can get at this is by watching what slaves did with their feet. That is, watching slaves move, because we can watch populations of slaves move around. And what we see is slaves, in some sense, beginning in 1861, in May of 1861, at the very outset of the conflict, we see slaves essentially lawyering with their feet, engaging in what's really an incredibly sophisticated lawyering strategy, knowing that moving across jurisdictional lines from slave state to free state for fugitive slaves before the war, or from Confederate lines to Union lines, will produce a legal crisis. You could think of the Emancipation Proclamation and of the laws of war themselves, since they come out of that emancipation moment, as having been caused by the enormous number of slaves who move into Union lines and force this question onto Union officials. So I think that thinking about the way the slaves thought of the laws of war is hugely important. You know, there's one dimension to this which is worth talking about. This code that Lieber writes Lincoln issues is not just good for slaves. There's a part of it that's actually swearing off certain forms of slave violence. We see in the final Emancipation Proclamation itself an exhortation to the slaves to not rise up and use violence, but to work for reasonable wages. And you can see in that an effort to contain the possible violence that people were worried would follow on emancipation. And you can see it in Lieber's code too. Because what Lieber's code says is that black soldiers in uniform get prisoner of war protections. But it also says that uprising behind Confederate lines, uprisings that go unspecified, but that we should think of as slave uprisings, that's the kind of uprising they're thinking about, will not produce prisoner of war protections. That is, the code announces that Jefferson Davis is free to treat as criminals, without Union recriminations at least, slave uprisings behind Confederate lines. So there's a whole set of things that go into slaves, now free people on January 1st, 1863, and the laws of war.
That's actually curiously reminiscent of after the first Gulf War, when there is an uprising by the Iraqi people, and the United States decides not to participate, not to give any protections to them militarily. I mean, that's fascinating. I want to ask a quick question that comes to us via Facebook before we run out of time. This comes from Kyle Lascaretz, who's a professor at George Washington University. Very interesting question. In assessing America's record of obeying, breaking, or setting the laws of war over its history, how does the United States compare to other countries? And do we at least beat the average?
That's good. I want to say no. I think people ask me, the one way I get this question is this a story about American exceptionalism? Is American exceptional in its moral structure? And I think no. I think these stories are stories that every cause, every republic, every state experiences in its own different ways. What's exceptional about the American story is the outsized influence that the United States has had on world history the last 150 years. And that's really the story of the United States from the Civil War to the present, is the story of the creation of a world superpower whose traditions have had outsized influence. Lieber's text is not just influential because it shapes American policy. Lieber's text becomes the foundation for the laws of war all around the world today. In the latter part of the 19th century, it's translated into every European language. It becomes the blueprint for European conventions in 1899, and then on into the 20th century, all the way through to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. We don't get international humanitarian law as it goes today without Lieber and Lincoln. That's the distinctive feature of American history, and the slavery's role in it is a distinctive feature. But American compliance, I think the United States finds itself with a lot of countries around the world in articulating a tradition and having a great deal of difficulty complying with it on all fronts. So I'd say no. I'd say this is a universal story with a distinctively powerful place for American history in it.
We talked about sort of the modern version of this, and I said in war and the sort of what defines war has evolved a lot in modern times. The war on terrorism and the war on drugs, we use these more amorphous names to define a state of war. And I was wondering, in this state where we don't identify an exact enemy or a nation per se, what are the moral implications for these times, and how have those changed from history?
Well, this is a great question, and actually I think is related to this last question in an oblique way, which is the use of war as a metaphor is a political tactic. I mean, it's a way of mobilizing and marshaling a population behind a political project. So the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on terror, or the like. These aren't technical legal uses. They're political uses in the public sphere. And one of the ways in which American history might be distinctive in the laws of war is that because the laws of war have operated in a democracy, it means that the channels of accountability are broad and democratic. And that, I think, creates lots of room, by the way, for serious entailments and consequences, costs outside of traditional judicial channels. Now, these uses of the laws of war, these metaphorical uses, I'm inclined to think they partake of one especially dangerous feature of American history with the laws of war, which for a minute I'll associate with the Second Amendment. So the Second Amendment is, in some sense, the American version of the French levée en masse of the 1790s. This is the moment in the French Revolution when the French revolutionary state empowers the entire republic, all of the citizens, to rise up as soldiers. Now, this is an incredibly dangerous moment for the laws of war, because the laws of war can only be followed if you train soldiers in how to follow them. If everyone becomes a soldier, well, then everyone's a target, everyone's a combatant, there are no limits, and no one's been trained in the rules. Amen, and I don't know which way, but it sounds pretty terrifying to me. Well, the Second Amendment is our levée en masse. The Second Amendment commits the early republic to not having standing armies of professionally trained soldiers, to turning citizens into soldiers, and there's a real danger in that democratic self-government and the basic constitutional commitments of democratic self-government will run afoul of the careful channels that the laws of war desperately try to create. And so when we see the laws of war invoked, when we see warfare invoked metaphorically for popular democratic purposes, I think you're seeing some version of that risk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. It's really been great. Thank you.